live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the Tholian Web, which is not one of the better episodes of Star Trek, or even of Season 3, if we're honest. The Tholian Web is a kind of convoluted storyline. Basically, there is a section of space where the fabric between dimensions is particularly thin, and so basically there is not necessarily temporal, but there's phasing between the two dimensions. The problem is that the USS Defiant, another starship, has gotten caught in that weak point in space. And so all of the crew have gone mad and killed each other. The Enterprise, nobody knows that, though. So the Enterprise is sent to investigate what happened to the Defiant. They show up. They see kind of weird semi-translucent and green version of the Defiant. It is basically a ghost ship at this point, both in the sense that everybody on it is dead and that the ship is fading from the reality of our universe, or the Star Trek universe. So Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Chekhov have gone over to the Defiant to see what's up. The transporters on the Enterprise are affected by general space wonkiness in this area. And so initially, Scotty is only able to transport back Spock, McCoy, and Chekhov. Kirk elects to remain behind, and essentially he gets sort of stranded, partially, at least, on the Defiant. Like, he gets sort of picked up by the transporter on a subsequent attempt, but he doesn't rematerialize. So he's in this weird sort of state of limbo. Spock is like, okay, what we have to do, we're going to sit right here, we're going to not disturb anything, because any disturbance to this area of space could fuck up the whole, it'll rephase, and we'll see the Defiant again goal. So that's the objective. Spock wants to sit and wait for the Defiant to reemerge so that they can get the captain and bring him back. These plans are complicated by the arrival of the Tholians, who are a hitherto unknown species that claimed this section of space, They show up. They're basically like, hey, get out of here or we'll destroy you. At which point Spock is like, listen, man, here's what's going on. We got this crazy rescue operation. We're trying to, get our captain back. The Tholians are like, all right, we will give you until exactly the time you have calculated, and then we will attempt to destroy you. The time that they had calculated for the next phase arrives. The Defiant does not. Spock surmises that the arrival of the Tholians in the area disrupted space enough that it threw off the phasing calculations. The Tholians start firing on the Enterprise, and finally Spock is forced to fire back. He basically just wrecks the Tholian ship and sends it sort of spinning off into space, not unlike what happens to Darth Vader at the end of A New Hope. But unlike in that situation, this Tholian, Loskin, the Tholian commander, has hauled up some other Tholians, and they bring a couple of ships out there, and they basically back the two ships up against one another, just out of phaser range, and then start pulling away, and there's these sort of golden fibrous strands dragged out behind them. What the Enterprise crew surmises is that Kirk is now dead because, they did a lot of disrupting of this area of space between the Tholians firing on the Enterprise firing on the Tholians, more Tholians showing up, etc., etc. So they do end up holding a memorial for Kirk. The Enterprise is also now kind of fucked because they used their phaser power, and this area of space is disrupting the ship's functionality, basically. Like, different systems go in and out of working. They determine that the Tholians are creating an energy web, and that if the Tholians complete it, there will be no way that the Enterprise can get out, even if they had the full power and functionality of the ship. And add to that, random crew members start going nuts and trying to kill people. Chekhov is the first one, which makes sense because he was on the Defiant. Although McCoy gets irritable, but it's not clear that he ever goes insane in this sort of space madness way that other crew people do. But a bunch of other random, otherwise nameless crew people go nuts, and they attack Scotty, or they attack Spock, or they attack McCoy in his lab, or whoever it is. McCoy is working on coming up with an antidote to this section of space, and that is literally the brief he's given. Come up with some way to prevent the space madness caused by the interaction between this dimension and another dimension. So all of that is going on. Things are looking quite bleak. And then Uhura, in her bedroom mirror, sees Kirk. And he's all like, oh, I'm a ghost. Oh, look at me being ghosty. Ooh. And initially they're like, well, Uhura's gone mad. And she's like, I don't feel like I'm mad. And they're like, yeah, well, you are. So we're going to restrain you in sickbay, even though other than this one thing, you're not displaying any other signs of madness. So that's a bit fucked up that they immediately jump to that. Then Scotty sees Kirk in the engineering section, and Kirk is again all like, ooh, I'm a ghost. You can see through me, but I'm here. Oh. And so they're somewhat less concerned that Uhura might be insane, so they let her go. Then Kirk shows up on the bridge, and Spock puts all the pieces together. Like, he realizes that somehow Kirk is weirdly not in the same out-of-phase-ness as the Defiant. So Kirk, because he was in the transporter beam at the time, is in his own somewhat locked-in-space area. So, at a particular point, they can beam Kirk aboard. Then, for some inexplicable reason, I think, given the laws of physics, this act of beaming Kirk aboard somehow throws them out of the Tholian Web and just into a different part of space. It's not real clear that there's any physical reason why that would happen. It seems like that just happens because they gotta wrap the episode up. They don't have time to actually deal with the Tholian Web as a legit problem facing the Enterprise. So, yeah, that's how it goes. So, there's not a massive amount about this episode that's great. I think the interesting thing in social justice terms is probably the depiction of madness. And this is a big thing for mental health and psychological distress, because there are very, very damaging stereotypes about mental illness, particularly the belief and the depiction of mentally ill people as being violent or prone to violence, when in reality the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness or psychological distress are not violent at all. And in fact, in the US today, we have particularly high rates of mental illness, which generally speaking has very little to do with violence. I think the rates are somewhere around 40% of people in the U.S. today, of adults in the U.S. today, have issues with particularly anxiety and depression. Now, realistically, that probably has much more to do with capitalism than anything else, but I don't want to go that route because I don't think this episode is critical of capitalism. But that tendency to depict people with mental illness or psychological distress as prone to violence is incredibly damaging. It creates, on the one hand, it creates layers of distrust that make it very difficult for people to talk about mental illness or to seek help for issues they may be having. There's well-documented issues with this, where the stigma surrounding mental illness has actually made it much less likely across decades. This data, I think, has been collected. The stigma around mental illness has made it much less likely that people will actually seek out professional help that would help them live a better quality of life when they are experiencing symptoms of anxiety, of depression, or more serious mental illnesses, things like this. So there's an actual negative impact on the person suffering because they are less likely to seek out treatment because of that stigmatization. But then also, particularly right now in the US, those who believe in largely unfettered gun rights tend to use mental illness as an excuse for not actually passing legislation that would help prevent mass violence. Every time in the US we see a mass shooting, and those of you who are outside the US who might be watching this, most other countries, certainly other countries in the global north, and even most countries, I think, in the global south, don't deal with these kinds of issues the way that the US does, where we just regularly have mass shootings in public spaces. And every time those things happen, those on the political right use the same rhetoric, which is, we need to invest in mental health resources. Now, they actually, when they have political power, tend to cut access to mental health resources, so clearly they are some lying fucks. But we knew that already. But this is one of the big issues. So we go in the contemporary U.S., we go even beyond the problem of stigmatizing mental health to the problem of stigmatizing mental health becomes presented as an alternative to actual strategies for minimizing mass violence. It ends up literally costing people's lives when politicians say this is a mental illness issue and not a gun issue. Now again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of the Tholian Web. They are not concerned with mass shootings. It wasn't an issue in 1968 when this episode premiered. But today, in our context of 2023, it most certainly is an issue.